So, well, this is going to be a little bit different again, as I found the introduction to battle cruisers was quite useful to Tuesday's battle cruiser discussion. And I thought before I started the Falklands War, I'd do an introduction to the Falklands War command structures. And then I remembered that I'd done a presentation which was pretty much that at the conference I organised. Well, I helped organise with a wonderful young lady historian called the Falklands Malvinas 37 years anniversary. And the reason we called it the Falklands Malvinas was because we were wanted to get veterans and people from both sides. And the Falklands War is what we call it in the UK. Malvinas War is what they call it in Argentina. And just like when you're dealing with Russia and the Great Patriotic War versus the Second World War, if you want to attract people from both sides and you want to try and get the best, most accurate picture you can by bringing both sides together, you have to make accommodations. And what I found interesting when we did organise that conference, which took place last year, must be now, was that the overwhelming vast majority, in fact, pretty much every veteran I spoke to was completely happy with that name. Only people who objected were, in the nicest way, mostly people who hadn't been anywhere near down the south. So I'm sure there were some who did though, and I can understand why people did. But it was a very good name to pick for what we wanted to do. And we had Michael Clapp, Julian Thompson, Lawrence Freeman, all sorts of people come along and speak at the conference, and it was incredibly well organised. I have to admit, my job was mostly the website and the Twitter, because it was being organised at Manchester University. And, well, you can kind of guess my girlfriend probably at this point, because if you've picked up, you'll know she's doing her PhD at Manchester University, and she's doing it in the Falklands War. So guess who I was organising the conference with? Yes, her name is Louise Clare. She's an amazing young historian, absolutely brilliant, far better than I'll ever be. So we did this conference, and this is the paper I presented at the conference, and we are now hoping to get a book to put together of all the papers. It's being sort of held up together by COVID-19 and all sorts of things, but we are getting there. But this is the introduction to the command structure used in the Falklands War. I've done some adaptation to the presentation to try and make it less interactive, so I can put the slides more plainly up there when I do that. But it's pretty much the same presentation I gave at the conference. It's going to be longer though, because at the conference I was being good time-wise. I kept myself to time, which, as most people testify to, me and keeping myself to time in conferences is not always my forte. Honestly, I write my presentations and my speeches are long enough that I should probably be made keynotes just to make sure I run to time. But far too junior for that one. But saying all that, I did enjoy it. It was fun to help organise a conference. It was fun to chair panels. I do enjoy helping, chairing a panel and helping usually young academics get their voices heard. Although in this case, because of the way the Falklands Malvinas conference was structured, we had represented islanders. An islander was speaking from the Falklands. We had journalists. We had academics, but we also had veterans, and often panels were a mixture of all, which was something which was really, really cool. And I'm involved in a bit with the Falklands 40th anniversary stuff, which is being done at King's College London. And I'm hoping we can replicate some of those formats. I'm hoping we can get veterans and academics on the same panels, because I think it's really interesting to have the contextual account from the academic and the first-hand account from the person who was there, and have them so you can hear the different tones and you can understand the differences of what's being said and why it's being said. Because often a first-hand account is brilliantly accurate, but it's brilliantly accurate for the person's own experiences while they were there. And an academic's account done from 8,000 miles and 30, 40 years away is also very accurate, but it's very accurate from all the sources they're given and all the context they put into it. It's a different form of accuracy. And it's interesting listening to the two side by side. Most of all, I hope to get Michael Clapp to, I'm planning going to have a chat with him. And I'm not going to make any promises because I haven't yet really asked him the question, but he's done it before, so I'm hoping he will agree, because he's done a podcast with me on SimSec. We did a podcast on the Falklands War series on Centre for International Maritime Security. The same people who are producing the Bilge Pumps podcasts, well, hosting the Bilge Pump podcast online for us. I'm doing all the editing. And so I'm hoping I can get him to do a Skype call and a video chat like I did with Jamie from Armoured Carriers, and I will post it up here, and like with the one for Jamie, it will have no monetization. It'll be completely free for anyone to use, for all the future historians and everyone to have access to without any adverts or anything, just as a sort of resource. Talk to the commander of the Falklands Amphibious Task Group. Assess him and assess his work for yourself. That'll be the plan. But as I said, I haven't even asked him. That's aiming to do that, but I'm aiming to do that because of the experience of him coming and presenting at this conference. He did. Him and Julian Julian Thompson, the brigade commander, our third command commander of the brigade, did an exceptional joint presentation, which I highly recommend. But Michael also did an introductory speech, and he chaired a panel, and you couldn't have had someone more willing to get involved. There was a lot of comments made that it was me and Louise organising the conference by the two of us. Yes, it was. But if we had a third person there organising it, well, we could have arguably had four, because we had Michael Clapp and William Spencer, who both bent over backwards in many, many ways to help us. And there were a few others who also got involved where they could. But those two really jumped in, chaired panels, did all sorts of things when other people dropped out or didn't want to do it, or at the last moment. We'd only have to look. And if one of those two was there, they would go, oh yeah, I'll do it. So Michael Clapp was really, really involved and really good at getting everyone involved. He wanted the Falkland Islands there. He wanted the Argentinians there. He wanted everyone there so that it was a full conference. Anyway, enough about the conference, which was a fun experience. Plus got some excellent beef at the end of it. Seriously, Louise was amazing at organising the food for that conference. She basically kept me out of it because she was worried that they'd end up with burgers and a barbecue, because that's what I like, so, and lots and lots of iron brew. But, no. So, not much further ado. This is Introduction to the Command Structures in the Falklands War, but it's done with the Innovation to Survive and Succeed presentation. Forgot the presentation word then. That was sad. Right. Right, so origins of modern British amphibious warfare. Now, I've been doing a lot about landing craft and a lot about landing ships lately, and you'll recognize some of these pictures as not too dissimilar to what I've been talking about. And a lot of those tools, these things, are things which came around based on the experience. Interesting I've put Admiral Richmond is a 1930s James Goldrick. If you haven't read Admiral Goldrick's works, I highly recommend you do here. But no, basically what happens with the amphibious warfare doctrine is they have a nascent facilities in the 1930s. Like the Americans, they developed a nascent facility more in the 1930s. You know, World War One has taught them what isn't going to work in modern amphibious warfare, but you know, it takes them a while to develop, as I said, what does work, and they are very keen on developing what will work, and they get to it. But World War II really accelerates that. So you come out of World War II and you have a humongous amount of experience, and that causes a problem. The trouble is with having a humongous amount of experience is that it can tempt you to think you don't need to professionalize and standardize things. You have literally various statistics run to 60 to 70% of the Royal Navy's senior officer corps had experience of amphibious warfare operations in some form or another. Ergo, well, D-Day alone had been colossal, but there have been so many others during World War II. Everyone had taken part in something. Everyone had ideas of how to do it. Everyone had to read the books. You didn't need to standardize. You don't need to professionalize this. You don't need a designated person for this. Well, the trouble is you do. The trouble is if you do not do anything to preserve that kind of memories, you can't. And you won't. And after Suez, they start to go, yes, we need something. And even after Korea, they thought they needed something. But then the Suez, they'd really decided they needed something. And then it's about 1971. They finally get it, about 15 years later, 20 plus years later than Korea. And you notice there is something interesting going on. One of the names I want you to highlight and think about is Derek RFL, but I haven't pointed out to him yet. The other ones I've got there are Michael Clapp, Peter J. Gundel, and J.A. James Miller. Now, why have I pointed out these three Commodores? Well, all of them commanded major amphibious operations, and every single one of them, to a man, hasn't got a Wikipedia page. Now, you've heard me talk about Michael Clapp before. I talked about him in the beginning here. I talked about him in the Admirals and a Commodore talk about commands. I've told you how good he is. Told you to please go read his book if you can. It's San Carl. I've got it around here somewhere. Anyway, he's got an excellent book about his time in San Carlos Bay and his time in command. He commanded the 1982 Amphibious Task Group in the Falklands War, and there is no Wikipedia page about him in English. Please note, I'm using a correct phrase here, in English. There is, though, one about Derek RFL, who was the Commodore a few years before Clapp, 2 years before Clapp, and was actually, at this point, the Vice Admiral carriers and amphibious warfare in the during the Falklands War. Now, there's a reason I've picked out Derek RFL, and I want you to remember that name as we go on. So, That's the history of ComTag. ComTag is basically, all right, so the idea is that you have a vice admiral of amphibious force groups and carrier warfare in charge of overall everything. And they would be command of the task force that would go forward. And then you'd have the Commodore amphibious warfare with the amphibious warfare ships and the Royal Marines aboard. And you'd have a Commodore carrier strike in charge of the Invincible class, basically. And they would all be going together. And that would be your sort of formation, and you'd have Admiral in charge and all these things. And there's a very good reason you have a Vice Admiral for this job. Basically, he's got to argue with a Vice Admiral fleet of the submarines. He's got to do all sorts of things. And there might well be a Rear Admiral put in underneath him as well. In fact, it would normally, because they're expecting in a scenario of Norway to start to take casualties, you normally would want a Vice Admiral, a Rear Admiral, and 2 Commodores there. And this was, remember, a time when Commodore wasn't an official rank. It was one given to a senior captain who was placed in charge. It was an operational rank rather than an actual part of the rank structure. And therefore, you know, these people who were given the title of Commodores are actually all captains for most part. But what they're doing, you know, if you're going into a scenario of, let's say, reinforcing Norway and fighting up the northern flank, the odds are you're going to take casualties. This is part of the British structure, the British thinking of war. So you'd have a Vice Admiral in charge, but you'd also have a Rear Admiral there as second in command. And you'd have 2 Commodores there who are specialists with senior captains as well as their second in commands. And so if worse comes to worse and you lose the Vice Admiral and the Rear Admiral, then you've got a couple of Commodores of which one of them can take charge. You know, you've got 4 senior officers in command ships in the task force able to take command. That's the idea. Whether it would work or not, it would work, let's be honest. So if the Soviets managed to wipe out all 4 in one go, that would be a very, very lucky day for them at the office. Anyway, next slide. Right now. So, theoretically, the amphibious warfare command structure is set out in various systems of the Allied tactical publications. Now, you have an interesting scenario with an amphibious task group in that technically you have the commander of the amphibious task group, whether they're a Commodore, Rear Admiral, whatever they are, sits at both this rank as a sort of task force rank and sits at the task group. Now, technically, we usually call them task group and task unit ranks. And you have the task unit would be when they're aboard the ships are the brigade underneath the brigadier and the ships underneath the Commodore. And the task group is underneath the Commodore. Okay? So technically, you have a triad, but the Commodore or Rear Admiral, if it's a division or whatever you sort of the rank you have, is fulfilling both. And the reason for this is because it has to be practical from a sea perspective. Okay? Yes, the Marines might be able to get ashore there. That might be great. But if the Navy can't hold the position and can't support them, there's no point deploying the Marines there. There's also the interesting thing with the change of operational command, in that the Marines request there's a chop of operational command, and then the Commodore makes a decision as to whether or not it's practicable. And usually that decision is informed by the logistics and by the scenario they're in. I.e., are the Marines ashore and able to operate completely on their own, or do I need to retain a veto because it's protection for them? Please note that what I just said, protection for the Marines. Not from the Marines, but actually from the higher-ups, asking them to do things they couldn't yet do. Because while there hasn't been a chop of operational command, It's far more difficult for people higher up the chain of command to start going, oh, yes, the Marines are sure and firm. They can start moving. They can start doing this, which they want to do. And so the Commodore Amphibious Warfare Group role is pretty much both as shepherd, guardian, and protector for the Marines. Gets them ashore, make sure that they're firm and happy before changing operational command, and then they can go off and do the land warfare job. Now, theoretically, if it's an amphibious raid, it might never be chopped. It's just a raid, bump in and out. But that's a sort of different scenario. This is a full amphibious landing. This is getting a brigade ashore. And by the way, please, when people turn around to me and go, oh, we're never going to need to land a brigade again. We're never going to need to do this. No. Look, you don't often need the facilities to land a brigade. I do agree with that. In fact, usually you can get away with probably a commando, a reinforced squadron, battalion size structure, especially if it's organically mobile, i.e. has its own vehicles. So US Marine Corps APC sort of facility. It can do probably 90% of amphibious operations. Remaining 9% are probably special forces. But 1% of the time, you need to do something very big. You need to land and secure a large enough beachhead to land more troops because you are not going to get a port and you need to do something quite important. You need to retake some islands which have been seized by a foreign power and they will have dug in. You're in a near-peer or peer-to-peer conflict. In all those circumstances, you will need a brigade. And if you can turn up with a brigade, you become a very useful ally, even if you've got, even to bigger allies who have far more capabilities. Because being able to land a self-supporting, organically independent amphibious brigade is a very major skill. It's an asset. It's a strategic ability that you can basically go to your allies. Well, if you get in problems, we can show up with a carrier battle group and an amphibious task group. And if doesn't matter if they take out the ports, it doesn't matter, my friends in Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia, my friends in Singapore or wherever in the world, doesn't matter if the enemy takes the ports or takes control of the ports. We can still come to your aid. We can still come and support you. Because we can do this. We can land a whole brigade if we need to. And it will come with artillery, with multiple battalions, with integrated armor, reconnaissance, all the assets it needs. And it will be useful. Now, it's quite an innovative command structure because you have a sort of duality of command, because despite the Commodore technically being two sides of the triangle, in practicality, for it to work well, they need to build a very much a close relationship with the Brigadier. They need to work in harmony. We are very lucky in 1982. Traditionally, there have been good relationships between the Commodores and the Brigadiers. They tend to work very hard to make sure they do have a good relationship. But in 1982, you had Michael Clapp, who's the Commodore AW, and the Commodore Amphibious Warfare. And you have Brigadier Julian Thompson, who is in charge of 3rd Commander Brigade. And they were very good friends. They're very good friends to this day. And you also actually had Michael Clapp as... you had Jeremy Larkin, Michael Clapp's flag captain, in charge of HMS Fearless, who is also one of the nicest people we've ever worked with and one of the smartest as well. He goes on to become a Vice Admiral. They work together so well, and they're still friends to this day. Anyway, on to the next one. Right then, prior to the Falklands War, you have an exercise going on, ice cold on northern flank. So they're training in Norway, and it's what the Royal Marines and the forces are really supposed to be doing. The problem is, though, that Norway had been run down. The exercises in Norway had been really run down. So instead of it being an amphibious operation exercise, it was a one company group landed in an administrative exercise, not the 15 company groups equivalent of putting 3rd Commander Brigade ashore in San Carlos. So, in simple terms, in exercises, they were running at 1/15 of the force they would employ. It was 1/9 of the force they were supposed to employ in wartime. They were supposed to. Remember that 15 company group includes a load of paras. So, just going by the Royal Marines, it was supposed to be 9 companies. It's not necessarily a bad scenario, but every single one of them is thinking that we are not doing this realistically enough. The idea was at this point that, of course, when the troops arrive in Norway, there will still be port facilities. Why do you have a landing ship dock if you're still going to have port facilities? Everyone knew the truth. Michael Clapp and Julian Thompson had worked very hard to save the LSDs from Knots cuts, and they'd done this by literally pointing out a realistic assessment of what would happen to Norwegian port facilities within 24 hours of war being declared. And the realistic assessment of whether or not the British would start deploying the Royal Marines and the Amphibious Task Group before war was declared. As close as Britain is to Norway, as we saw in all the discussions recently on Norwegian campaign in 1940, it's going to take longer than 24 hours to get the brigade there with all their equipment. And that is the advantage of amphibious warfare. This is why it survives. Because your brigades don't just turn up in penny packets, they turn up as a brigade with all their heavy equipment with them, and all their logistics and all their supplies with them. It's terrible, but it's efficient. It's scary in the modern missile age, in the modern defenses that they're planning on putting on the shores and various scenarios, which is going to make suppression of enemy defenses even more critical an operation. But suppression of enemy defenses has always been a critical operation as amphibious task groups for amphibious warfare. Even in the Falklands War, they suppress an enemy platoon which is overlooking San Carlos Bay. They basically take them out, but they suppress them and capture them. D-Day, Torch, all these operations have faced levels of opposition, of defences. It's a common thing, and at a certain point you just have to decide whether or not you're prepared to an operation is important enough that you're prepared to risk ships and men and women. Are you prepared to risk them all? If you are, if the operation is important enough to national interest, national security, to the strategic needs of the nation, then you're going to have to risk these things. And if you're going to have to risk them, well, when you take a risk, the odds of everyone getting back is not that high, as much as we might like to. So, in this case, they had been training in Norway. So they got very good at the cold. They knew about fighting in cold weather, but the amphibious side of the amphibious operations was not done so well and has not practiced so well. But they were still doing it, and the skills were still there. Just not as sharply honed as they needed to be. But you again were lucky. You had Michael Clapp and Julian Thompson. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but these two officers really knew their stuff. They'd done a lot of research. They'd done a lot of wargaming, exercises with their staff, reading of history. You won't always get officers like that who can compensate for the lack of time you spent exercising them realistically by going and doing work on their own time. I have to say, both of them have very understanding and wonderful wives who didn't mind losing their husbands for probably days on time into their studies to read books. Anyway, next slide. Now, Falklands War command structure. This structure I have put out in according with ATP 1, ATP 8, and all the other systems. Some of that is a quote from an interview which I had with Michael Clapp when I was interviewing him for my dissertation during my bachelor. I first met Michael Clapp in 2007, so 13 years ago. And this is the structure as it should have been deployed. You should have had Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, Commander South Atlantic Task Force, back in London. Air Vice Marshal Sir John Curtis as Air Force's Deputy, Major General Jeremy Moore as Land Forces Deputy, because, well, it's an amphibious operation, and so it's going to be a Royal Marine at this point. And then down the second echelon, you have two Vice Admirals, Derek Greffel as Theatre Commander and Peter Herbert as Flag Officer Submarines, FOSSUM. Now, then you have Rear Admiral Stanley Woodward as Commander Carrier Battle Group, Commodore Clapp as Commander Amphibious Task Group, and then you have Brigadier Thompson as Commander Land Force, because this is while they're actually going at sea, while they're travelling south. This is what they should have done initially. And then the moment you have the chop, Julian would have come up to this rank, come up to the third echelon, because that's really what, because this is the task units, okay? And that's why Michael Clapp's also down here, because Michael Clapp is both a task unit and a task group commander. And then you have a sort of task force theatre commander scenario going on, which makes sense, okay? Because the task force includes the submarines, but you have no ships down there which can really control submarines properly. So you need to have the person back in London able to coordinate between the two, because submarines are so critical for the anti-ship system and for preserving the exclusion zone. And Vice Admiral Derek Greffel deployed down as a theatre commander, probably aboard either HMS Bristol or a County-class destroyer, because they have humongous command facilities aboard them and are designed for this scenario to take a staff, to take all sorts of things down there, so that Stanley Woodward could concentrate on fighting the Carrier Battle Group, Michael could concentrate on being an Amphibious Task Group commander, and the lovely Derek Greffel, who of course had been Commodore Amphibious Warfare, was the Vice Admiral in charge of carriers and amphibious ships anyway, could have spent his time dealing with the politicians up above and making sure that the lower commanders were able to do their jobs, making sure, explaining to our politicians what they were doing, and explaining probably to the press what they were doing, and coordinating between them and settling any disputes that arise between various task group commanders, because there will always be disputes between task group commanders. One of the most interesting ongoing disputes between the two is that Michael Clapp keeps asking for the trawlers, which have been sent in to support various amphibious operations, because they've been modified and because they have a nice launching system down, and launch and recovery system for boats, slipway, down their back, thanks to their own chute design. He wants them for the special forces and for some of the launching quick raids. But every time he brings them up to the staging zone to bring them into San Carlos,
bay, Sandy Woodward sends them back because they're annoying and slow and holding up his task group. Which you can understand. You can understand. For Sandy Woodward, they are very annoying. And the trouble is, your task force commander, as was set up with Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse sitting back in Northwood, really can't get involved in this sort of scenario because that's down there. So you two are supposed to figure this out between you, basically between you. But you have the scenario that Michael is technically a Commodore, which is, as I said, is a operational rank, not a natural rank. He's a captain. And Sandy Woodward is a rear admiral. So technically, while they're both task group commanders, Sandy outranks Michael. You see the problem? Whereas if you'd had a theatre commander down there, they could have settled it. But the command structure doesn't actually resemble that. Yeah. So, this is the command structure as was initially theorized by someone. I'm never quite sure where this comes from. I've got it from one of my books, but it's appeared in other places as well. And in the official readings, I've never really seen this command structure actually used. I think someone put it together quickly who hadn't read the Allied tactical publications. And you must remember at this point, after the closure of Greenwich a few years ago and other things, the Navy really didn't have that great a staff corps officers. So they had problems. And I think someone threw this together quickly. Because within like a day, it changes to this, where you've got Commodore Michael Clapp in CT-317. CTF-317 is Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse. And then you've got CTG-317, Commodore Michael Clapp. CTG-317.1, the Commander Landing Forces, Brigadier Julian Thompson. CTG-317.8, Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward. And CTG-317, Captain Brian Young, in charge of Operation Parakeet. And CTG-324, Vice Admiral Peter Herbert, Fossum. Now, here's another problem in the nicest way, because this is the command structure they then claim they're going to be operating on. What's the first problem you've noticed? They've automatically promoted Julian Thompson to his own task group already. That's against the complying and the whole nature of the amphibious task group commander, the Commodore AW, and the way it works. Sandy Woodward and Michael Clapp and everyone is now the same rank. So technically, they've mucked up the structure again. So much for knowledge. Anyway, so this is what theoretically they operate under, and Jeremy Moore takes over from Julian Thompson and all sorts of things. This is how it ends up really sort of working then, and I've put it in slightly bigger sort of details this time. The Air Force's deputy is still the same Air Vice Marshal, but it gets confusing. And well, that doesn't get confusing. It's him, but there's lots of other people who claim they were the deputy air forces, and I don't want to get into that fight. So it was him, but I'm not getting into that fight. And this is how it works. Honestly, Michael and Julian informally keep to the traditional Commodore amphibious warfare structure because that works for them. And they issue the chop of Operation Command, and people go, oh, there's been a chop. Ah, they were operating properly. So expect some time to find a retroactively, this was the operational command structure we were using thing put in, where everything's put in its right order. And don't be surprised if it looks something kind of similar to the first one I produced. But this is what they were actually operating under. But that's not the last slide. So we have adoption growth. Now here's the interesting thing. 3rd Commander Grade as structured is an elite light infantry formation, and it's still to this day structured around that. And yes, in my ideal world, I might want them to adopt a sort of more, at least motorized, 8-wheel APC approach, basically taking the US Marine Corps APC systems, but I can't see them doing that anytime soon. So, as much as I might think it makes sense for all the things they're talking about, they're an elite light infantry formation, but they're also organic. They've got their own inbuilt specialist logistics formation, specialist engineering formation, specialist air defense formation, specialist artilleries. All commando certified. All have to get the green berets and all sorts of things. They have medical team provided by the Royal Navy and all sorts of fun stuff added into them to make them as adaptable to amphibious warfare as possible. But they also are slightly over-engineered for a significant purpose, so they can adopt other departments, other units. So they originally, the plan was they would get the Dutch. But of course, in the Falklands War, they don't get the Dutch. They get the Gurkhas, they get the Paras, and they get light tanks. Light tanks were very, very exciting as far as they were concerned, and very, very useful. They wish they'd had more of them. One of the interesting things when they're heading down to the Falklands is they're told that, oh no, don't take tanks with you. The Falklands soil won't support tanks. And they go, can we have some light tanks? Give them the light tanks, but oh, they won't be useful. You won't be able to use them much. They jolly well use them a lot. And this is another reason why I think, in the nicest way, some APCs would be useful. Because look at how well the light tanks performed in the Falklands. Look at how well the Challenger tanks performed in AL4. They're useful. Right, next slide. You also have to adapt other sections within it. One of the interesting things I always find in the stories about the Falklands War is the reality that the Mountain and Arctic Warfare Cadre, which is quite an elite formation in the Royal Marines, are adapted have a wartime role. So they are a training cadre, but they have a wartime role. And the wartime role is this sort of deep reconnaissance force. They are pretty much almost an elite. They could be. Their skill level is definitely up there with the special forces in certain regards in terms of their reconnaissance ability, and they are used for this shamelessly. So often I'm reading some analysis as written on the Falklands War, and one book I read said these guys were the SAS. They're not. They're the training cadre. I'm not going to reveal the book or the author. I'm not that cruel. I did send them an email. The other thing I've read is that quite often in books you have, especially books written by people who were journalists down there at the time, have given them said that their job was actually they were the SBS doing that, or the SAS, or this doing this mission, and actually no, it was the Mountain and Arctic Warfare Cadre. So they get into a lot of interesting jobs. And we sometimes talk about the Special Forces Support Group, the group that in Afghanistan especially were used to provide fire support to Special Force operations drawn from the Paras and the Marines. Well, the Mountain Arctic Warfare Cadre were doing a lot of that in the Falklands War. They would often be the ones supporting them if they were sort of over, but it's kind of a Royal Marines version of the Long Range Desert Patrol Group and that sort of thing. This is what the Mountain Arctic Warfare Cadre are doing, and they are amazing at it. So please go look them up. Summary. Yeah, a great quote from Tyrion Lannister. My mind is my weapon, my brother has his sword, King Robert has his warhammer, and I have my mind. And a mind needs books as a sword needs whetstone, if it's to keep its edge. So why did I structure everything like I have done? Well, let's see. I started off with discussing war games and exercises last week. Okay, did war games and exercises. This week, I've looked at battle cruisers, and now I'm looking at amphibious task groups. All have a similar connection. All are things which are major operations in wartime and are critical in certain areas of war, but they need a lot of practice and a lot of thought about how they're going to get used. And here was everyone thinking I threw these whole presentations together randomly. Actually, no, I do apply some thought. I know. It's shocking, most of all to me. But it was interesting. It was interesting. And the interesting thing is, especially as we move into reserves, doing far more of the role in various parts of the British forces, how are we going to keep the reserves up to the level of no, not so much how do we keep the reserves up to the level of skill they need to be. They're going to keep to the skill level, but how do we keep the reserves and the regulars up to the level of interoperation that they can seamlessly jump in with not a few weeks training or a few months training, but a few hours training. And I think the solution has to be wargaming. It has to be maybe online wargaming or some sort of scenario. I think we have to come up with a way that we can get everyone involved as their time can suit them, so that we can fit around and we can get people into it. Okay, I think we need to do that. But that's just me. Now, I kept in the any questions slide from my presentation, mainly because it's some cool photos and it's been the background of the whole talk. Next slide. So, I said earlier, Michael Clapp doesn't have an English language page about him in Wikipedia. He doesn't. But he does have one written in, I think, Spanish. I did some searching for that, and I found it. And it was an interesting time to find. Anyway, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed it all.